I've got a sinus infection, but I'll try. As Professor Evans said, we've known each other a long time. My husband was on the faculty here, and then we sort of did a little shifting around. We lived both on the east and west coast. In fact, when we left the west coast, we headed to Virginia. Now, up to that point in my life, I had worked in a library, I'd worked in retail, I had worked dipping ice cream at a Baskin-Robbins, I worked at a college bookstore, and I worked in secretarial positions. And we had 2 kids in college. And you know, that takes a little money. So I was looking for a job. We got to Newport News and looked in newspapers, and you know, I applying for secretarial jobs. And then one day I looked and there was something at Williamsburg. And Williamsburg was about 15 miles away from where we were living. And I said to my husband, if you don't mind, this is a place I love. We visited it in 1969. And I'd like to try there until I get a job. He said, okay. So I went up there, and by that time she'd moved in with us, and I made her come with me. Poor kid. Anyway, so we applied, we filled out all the forms, and they called us back. Now, when I was interviewed, I said, there's just one problem. I don't know much about Virginia history. And they said, that's all right. We'll teach you the history you need. All we want are people who like people and can communicate. Whew. Because I knew diddly squat about Virginia history. Knew a lot more about, you know, New England than I did about Virginia. And they started us out in 1607, when the first permanent settlement in the American colonies was established. So we went through 17th century history up into the 18th century. We learned using primary source documents, things like diaries and letters and things of that nature about the way people lived. We also had actually a twofold task before us, because we were hired to do 2 things. One was to take school groups and other groups on tours on the streets, which meant that we wore street clothes. We are also then going to be working, to start out with, in 3 houses and the 2 taverns, in costume, giving tours. So we were called historical interpreters. You can kind of make the connection there. The interesting thing is, we had about the biggest class they'd ever had brought in, around 50 of us. And we ranged in educational levels from a high school graduate to a PhD in poli-sci. So education was not the big deal. It's what they could push into our brains and how well we would interact with visitors. Because we were on the streets, it was necessary to be able to understand what was going on in the craft shops, because we were going to be taking groups in there. We had to learn protocols too, of course, because some craftsmen were a little fussier about the way you approach things than others. So we learned a lot about, you know, bookmaking or printing and wheelwright shop and the Coopers where they made barrels and all that sort of thing. Got to know those people pretty well. And then this took 3 months just to get us that far. So we started taking tours on the streets, usually school groups. Now, if you had kids who were, junior high, we had a special tour for each group, by the way, and this one was called Young People Old Times, or YPOTs as we call them. And we were teaching kids about travel, taverns, which were inns of the time, and just everyday life kind of things. And then, of course, we went through high school kids and then adults, and then all the way up to senior citizens, and we called those OPOTs because that was old people, old times. But that was, we survived sometimes just by poking fun at things. Because it could get pretty hectic, particularly on hot summer days when you had about 100 people in line, and you could only take 20 or 30 at a time through a building. So you had to entertain them while they're waiting to go in the building, then you took your turn giving tours through the building, and then you had security, so nobody would steal anything, and then you could have a break. So after those 3 months of training, we got the colonial history, we got the history or the information about the people, and we were also taught to avoid working from a script. You have no idea how absolutely deadly boring it can be to have to say the same thing over. I don't know how people on the stage do it. If you were on Broadway and you're on for 2 or 3 years, how do you keep it fresh? So what they did was to teach us the basics, what you need in this space, what you need in this house, what you're talking about, and say, okay, focus on, say, an object in the room. Talk about that object and then tie the people in this house to that object. And it worked so well that one time I was giving a tour in the Capitol building, and I had been up to visit George Mason's home outside of Washington, D.C. And my entire tour was a focus on the relationship of George Mason with the colonial history. My supervisor happened to be going along with me on that tour. She said, "That was wonderful. I never did it again. I couldn't have repeated it. But I was so fresh with that information, and it tied in so well with the Capitol building, that's one of those things I'm really proud of." So we worked the summer, and then in the fall, when things calmed down a little bit more, we were trained again. And this time we added the Capitol and the jail, which were near one another. And then later on, the next year, the palace. And later on, the next fall, they took us out to Carter's Grove. Now, Carter's Grove was a plantation, 18th century plantation house. It's a mansion. It's some 8 or 10 miles away from town. It has a big, it's a riverside plantation, so it's pretty impressive. But it also had associated with it a reconstruction of the Woolston hometown, which was one of the first settlements, a 17th century settlement. There's a nice museum there and all this sort of stuff. But that didn't work out too well. They decided, no, they're not going to move us all around like that. And so we stayed in town, but we still had that training. The first day at work was scary. I mean, you got all this stuff in your head. You think, oh my God, I'm gonna blow it. I mean, there's all these people, you've never seen them before. I make a mistake and they're gonna laugh at me if they know anything. But we've been told, keep in mind, you spend this time being trained, you know more than most of the people walk in that door. You can have confidence because you know so much. If you remember it, I thought, but it worked. I mean, if I remember facing my first crowd, I thought, oh God, like that. But then when you get people to interact with you, and you get comfortable with it, it's not so bad. I've always said, and I've told people at Williamsburg too, the thing I liked about working there is I could teach history, but I didn't have to do write tests, grade papers, or write out
lesson plans.
Yeah, it's there. I know what to do, and I don't have to fool around with anything else. The government aspects of it, of course, are the ones that lead us right up to the revolution. Although you have to think about in terms of what was the colonial governorship like, and the interactions of the colonists with the various governors as they came through. And then in January through March, every year, we were back in training. We had professors from the College of William and Mary come. There was a department at Colonial Williamsburg whose purpose was training. So there were about 5 or 6 people in that. They were the ones who trained us at first. And some of those professors from William and Mary were really super. Now, sometimes some of the people we worked with were students of William and Mary. In particular, and sometimes in the summertime to kind of pad up the roles, if you will. One of the things that I remembered in particular about the training was later on, they brought in a woman who was a storyteller. And it was her goal to teach us some of the techniques of storytelling. And I confess I found that very helpful when you're trying to like deal with kids, or even subsequently if I read a story to a kid, I use some of the techniques that she taught. So it was a very, I don't know how to put it, but it was always very challenging there. Well, we were there a couple of years, and they decided they had real problems with this business of having about 200, 250 people doing the two jobs. The logistics of trying to find people to fill gaps when somebody got sick for both tours, the street tours, and in the buildings, just was a headache. It was really hard on the staff. So they said, all right, we'll split them. You have to make up your mind. You're going to go with street tours or you're going to go with the houses. And that was hard. Because one of the advantages of giving the tours was because it was different every time. It's like one time when I was giving a tour, it was a group from Germany. And there were two people who really didn't want to go on the regular tour, but they didn't speak any English. And fortunately, there was a woman who was bilingual, and she came with us, and she told me as we started out, these two people were gardeners. They had a business in floral and gardening. And so I gave them a tour of the gardens of Florida Williamsburg. Made them happy. And it made me happy too, because it was different. That was part of the problem. You think about, if I go in the building all the time, am I going to be bored out of my skull? As I talked to a woman who worked at Ash Lawn, which is Monroe's house, not too far from Jefferson's Monticello, and we were talking in the break room after she gave me the tour, and she said, oh, I kill for a job like that. Because there she goes, the same tour over and over and over again. At any rate,